In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. Welcome to Journey to Jannah, where timeless wisdom meets the present day. Here we bring you audiobook-style biographies of the greatest minds in Islamic history, scholars, thinkers, and reformers who shaped the course of knowledge, faith, and civilization. From Imam Abu Hanifa to Ibn Sina, from Al-Ghazali to Sayyid Qutb, each story is a journey through trials, triumphs, and unwavering dedication to the pursuit of truth. Sit back, reflect, and let your heart travel through centuries of Islamic heritage. One voice, one story, one lesson at a time. Subscribe now and begin your journey toward knowledge, inspiration, and Jannah, inshallah. Journey to Jannah, where knowledge lives. Ibn Taymiyyah, the fire of faith.
In the shifting sands of the medieval Islamic world, where empires rose and fell like waves in the desert, there lived a man whose voice burned bright against the gathering darkness. A scholar, a rebel, a beacon, Taqi al-Din Ahmad ibn Taymiyyah was no ordinary figure. His life was a tumultuous dance of fierce conviction and relentless pursuit of truth, carving a path through theological storms, political upheavals, and personal hardship. He was a man who dared to challenge the powerful, whose ideas echoed centuries beyond his time, shaping the very soul of Islamic thought. This is his story.
Roots in the cradle of knowledge.
The year was 661 in the year of the Hijra, 1263 Gregorian calendar by the Gregorian calendar, a time when the Islamic world stretched across vast lands, from the bustling bazaars of Baghdad to the desert edges of Harran. It was in this ancient city, nestled near the banks of the Balik River, that Ahmad ibn Taymiyyah first opened his eyes to the sunlit world. The city was a mosaic of cultures and ideas, a place where traders, scholars, and mystics crossed paths beneath minarets that reached for the heavens. Ahmad's family was known not for wealth or power, but for something far more enduring: knowledge. His grandfather, Ibn Taymiyyah the Elder, was a respected jurist and scholar in his own right. The family's roots were planted deeply in the fertile soil of Islamic jurisprudence and theology. This heritage was a mantle passed from father to son, from generation to generation, like a sacred flame kept alive through centuries. From the earliest days, Ahmad was surrounded by this world of learning. The walls of his childhood home echoed with the soft murmurs of scholars debating fiqh, the Islamic law, and tafsir, the exegesis of the Qur'an. Books lined the shelves, their pages worn and fragrant with the musk of time. His father, a man of stern piety and unwavering devotion, was one of his first teachers, instilling in the boy the importance of sincere worship and relentless study. But this sanctuary of learning was soon to be shattered. The Mongol horde, a storm of destruction that had already left much of Central Asia in ruins, swept westward with terrifying speed. Cities fell like dominoes, their walls breached, their libraries burned, and their people scattered. Harran was no exception. When Ahmad was barely 10 years old, his family was forced to flee, leaving behind the city of his birth, the books he had barely begun to cherish, and the streets where his childhood laughter once rang out. They moved westward toward Damascus, a city that, even then, was a jewel of the Islamic world. It was here, amid the bustling streets and ancient mosques, that young Ahmad's mind would truly begin to awaken. The journey was arduous and fraught with peril. Each step westward was a test of endurance, a lesson in faith. But it was also a journey into the very heart of Islamic civilization, a world pulsing with intellectual vigor and spiritual devotion. In Damascus, Ahmad found himself among scholars and students, jurists and mystics, all engaged in a ceaseless quest for understanding. At the great Umayyad Mosque, where prayers rose in fragrant clouds, Ahmad would sit for hours, listening to the call of the muezzin and the rhythmic cadence of learned voices reciting the Qur'an. His memory, sharp and eager, absorbed every lesson like the thirsty earth drinks rain. By the time he reached his teenage years, Ahmad had memorized vast portions of the Qur'an and was fluent in the intricacies of hadith, those sacred sayings of the Prophet Muhammad that guide the faithful. Yet what set Ahmad apart was not just his prodigious memory or his mastery of texts. It was the fire of inquiry that burned within him, a refusal to accept inherited wisdom without challenge, a restless spirit seeking to understand not only the letter of the law, but its spirit. He would often engage his teachers in heated debate. He pushed against the boundaries of accepted thought, seeking clarity in a world clouded by political and theological strife. His tutors recognized early on that Ahmad was no ordinary student. Among them was the renowned scholar Ibn al-Qayyim, who would later become not only his disciple, but also a devoted companion and biographer. Their relationship was one of mutual respect and shared passion, a partnership forged in the fires of scholarship and faith. But even in this sanctuary of knowledge, the world outside was turbulent. The Mongol threat lingered like a shadow. The Mamluk Sultanate, ruling from Cairo, was locked in a desperate struggle to protect the lands of Islam. Ahmad's childhood was thus shaped by tales of battles, of sieges, and of survival. This political backdrop would soon draw him not only into theological debates, but into the fierce arenas of political power and rebellion. And so, the boy who fled Harran would grow into a man whose voice would echo across centuries, whose words would ignite the hearts of millions, and whose life would be a testament to courage, conviction, and unyielding faith.
The awakening of a scholar.
In the labyrinthine streets of Damascus, amidst the scent of jasmine and the hum of merchants' voices, Ahmad ibn Taymiyyah's life took on a new rhythm. The city was a living, breathing classroom. Every corner held a lesson, every call to prayer a reminder of a higher purpose. Here, the restless boy who had escaped war and exile began to discover the boundless world of knowledge that awaited him. Ahmad's days were filled with study, debate, and prayer. He enrolled in the city's renowned madrasas, where scholars of every school of thought gathered like stars in a dark sky. These scholars illuminated the path for seekers like him. The curriculum was vast and demanding: grammar, rhetoric, logic, jurisprudence, theology, and the intricate science of hadith. But Ahmad's hunger was not merely for knowledge, it was for truth. He threw himself into his studies with a fierce determination. The memorization of texts was only the beginning. His mind craved understanding, nuance, and above all, sincerity. Where others might have been content to follow the path laid before them, Ahmad was relentless in questioning, probing, dissecting every idea until it stood unshaken or crumbled. Among his many teachers was the great scholar Ibn Qudamah, a master of Hanbali jurisprudence. The school of Islamic law Ahmad would come to champion. Ibn Qudamah saw in the young student a rare fire, one that combined deep respect for tradition with an unyielding will to purify faith from the dust of innovation and confusion. Ahmad's theological views began to crystallize during these formative years. He was drawn to the pure, unadulterated message of the Qur'an and the Sunnah, the practices of the Prophet Muhammad. But the Islamic world he lived in was a tapestry woven with competing ideas. These ideas included sects and sometimes bitter rivalries. Mysticism, philosophy, and theological speculation had taken root in many corners, and Ahmad saw these as clouds obscuring the radiant light of authentic Islam. His voice began to rise, first softly, then with growing strength, calling for a return to the original sources, to the Quran and authentic hadith, stripped of later accretions. He saw clearly the dangers of blind imitation, or taqlid, which he believed shackled the minds and hearts of Muslims, preventing them from truly engaging with their faith. But his courage to speak truth to power would soon bring him into conflict, not just with rival scholars, but with political authorities. Even as Ahmad deepened his scholarship, the political landscape of Syria and the wider Islamic world was turbulent. The Mamluks, rulers of Egypt and Syria, faced threats from Mongol invaders and Crusader states. The stability of the realm was fragile, and the rulers often wary of voices that challenged their authority, even if those voices came wrapped in religious wisdom. Ahmad was no stranger to these tensions. His sermons and writings began to criticize rulers who, in his view, failed to uphold the Sharia or Islamic law, and who compromised the integrity of the faith for political expediency. This fearless stance earned him both admiration and enemies. Yet, Ahmad remained undeterred. His faith was a fortress, and his scholarship a sword forged in the fires of devotion and adversity. He sought not power or prestige, but the revival of an Islam that was pure, vibrant, and unyielding to corruption. As his reputation grew, so did the shadow of opposition. The stage was set for a life marked by relentless struggle between tradition and innovation, faith and politics, conviction and persecution.
The scholar against the tide.
As the years unfurled in Damascus, Ahmad ibn Taymiyyah transformed from a passionate student into a formidable scholar, a man whose words carried weight not just in lecture halls, but in the hearts and minds of the people. His presence was magnetic, a blend of humility and unshakable resolve. People came from distant lands to hear him speak, to witness the fire of his convictions. His writings, dense with knowledge yet bursting with clarity, tackled the complexities of Islamic law and theology head-on. He did not shy away from controversy. Rather, he embraced it. Ahmad was convinced that the Muslim community, Ummah, had strayed from the true path, obscured by blind adherence to past interpretations and the seductive allure of philosophy and mysticism, which he saw as dangerous distractions. One of his most defining battles was against the widespread acceptance of speculative theology, known as kalam, and certain Sufi practices that, in his eyes, blurred the clear lines of monotheism, tawheed. Ibn Taymiyyah believed that these trends diluted the purity of the faith and invited confusion and division. He championed a return to the textual sources, the Qur'an and authentic hadith, and rejected excessive rationalism that, he argued, led believers away from the simplicity and sincerity of the Prophet's message. His call was not merely academic, it was a call to spiritual revival. But scholarship was never divorced from the turbulent politics of the age. The Mamluk rulers, while patrons of the arts and learning, were wary of Ibn Taymiyyah's outspoken nature. When he condemned certain rulers for failing to uphold Sharia law or for compromising with non-Muslims, he quickly earned powerful enemies. His life became a series of trials, both literal and figurative. He faced multiple imprisonments, accusations of heresy, and fierce opposition from scholars and political figures alike. Yet, imprisonment did not silence him. Behind bars, his pen continued to move, producing treatises that would echo through time. One of his most famous imprisonments was in the citadel of Damascus, where the walls, cold and unyielding, could not quell the fire inside him. There he wrote extensively, debating his opponents and clarifying his stance on key theological issues. His imprisonment only added to his legend, a scholar who would not bow, a man who stood firm even when surrounded by chains. His political stance was uncompromising. During the Mongol invasions, when some Muslim leaders sought peace or alliance with the invaders, Ibn Taymiyyah called for resistance and jihad, framing the conflict in spiritual as well as political terms. He argued that the Mongols, despite their conversion to Islam, did not rule by Sharia, and thus their dominance was illegitimate. This bold position made him a lightning rod for criticism, but also a beacon. He became a beacon for those yearning for a pure and just Islamic governance. His ideas planted seeds that would later inspire reform movements centuries after his death. Despite the turbulence, Ibn Taymiyyah remained deeply spiritual. His personal struggles, the hardships of exile, imprisonment, and constant opposition, did not embitter him. Instead, they deepened his reliance on God and his commitment to truth. Behind the scholar's stern exterior was a man of profound faith who prayed with intensity, fasted rigorously, and lived simply. His life was a testament to conviction, perseverance, and the relentless pursuit of righteousness in a world riddled with complexity and compromise. As the storm of his life raged on, Ibn Taymiyyah's legacy was quietly taking shape. His ideas, once controversial and condemned by many, were beginning to inspire a new generation of thinkers who sought to reclaim the heart of Islam.
The last stand in eternal flame.
As the sun dipped low over Damascus, casting long shadows over the ancient city's minarets and domes, Ahmad ibn Taymiyyah's life entered its final and most turbulent phase. Now, in his 50s and 60s, the scholar stood at the crossroads of fate, a figure both revered and reviled, a beacon of unwavering faith amid encroaching darkness. His voice, sharpened by years of struggle, rang louder than ever. His writings grew more urgent, more expansive, as if time itself was slipping through his fingers. Yet the opposition intensified. Accusations of heresy, fueled by rivals, threatened by his growing influence, became relentless. His critiques of popular religious practices and powerful rulers made him many enemies. In 1306, Gregorian calendar, after a series of arrests and confrontations, Ibn Taymiyyah was imprisoned in the notorious citadel of Damascus once again. This time, his captivity was more severe. The stone walls closed in, but the fire within refused to die. Behind those cold bars, he continued to write treatises that dissected theology, law, and governance, leaving behind a vast corpus that scholars would study for centuries. His health began to decline. Years of hardship, the strain of imprisonment, and the weight of battles fought etched lines of fatigue and pain on his face, but his spirit remained unbroken. In these final days, he embodied the paradox of a man who had lived in conflict, yet found peace in faith. He continued to pray with fervor, teach with clarity, and inspire those around him. When he passed away in 1328, Gregorian calendar, the city mourned a scholar unlike any other. His funeral was attended by scholars and commoners alike, a testament to the deep impact he had made. But Ibn Taymiyyah's true legacy was only beginning to unfold. The ripples of a controversial genius. In the years and centuries after his death, Ibn Taymiyyah's ideas did not fade into obscurity. Far from it. His call for a return to the pure sources of Islam, his fierce critique of innovation, bid'ah, and his political thought about governance and jihad inspired countless movements. From the early reformers of the 18th and 19th centuries to modern Islamic revivalists, his name became synonymous with courage, scholarship, and reform. His works provided a foundation for thinkers who sought to reconcile tradition with the challenges of modernity, who wrestled with how to live faithfully in a changing world. At the same time, his critics warn against rigid literalism, cautioning that his sharp critiques sometimes overlooked the richness and diversity of Islamic spirituality and law. The man beyond the texts. But beyond the controversies and debates, Ibn Taymiyyah remains a deeply human figure, a man who wrestled with doubt and hope, who faced exile and imprisonment, yet never surrendered his faith. His story is not only of doctrine and law, but of resilience, integrity, and the relentless search for truth. To read his life is to witness a soul set ablaze by conviction, a flame that continues to illuminate the paths of those who seek meaning, justice, and spiritual renewal.
The pen that outlived empires.
Long after the gates of the citadel of Damascus had closed on Ibn Taymiyyah's life, his voice echoed louder than ever before. Not in sermons, not in courts, but in the rustle of parchments, in the weight of his books, in the trembling of empires and the restlessness of future thinkers. Ahmad ibn Taymiyyah had not simply written books. He had carved entire rivers into the bedrock of Islamic thought, flowing into valleys far beyond his own century. The creed reclaimed. At the heart of his theology was Tawhid, the oneness of God, not as a doctrine to recite, but as a force to live by. To Ibn Taymiyyah, Tawhid al-Rububiyyah, affirming Allah's lordship, was not enough unless paired with Tawhid al-Uluhiyyah, affirming Allah's exclusive right to be worshipped. He warned that many people claimed belief in Allah, yet allowed their hearts to bow to saints, graves, kings, or philosophies. To him, these were subtle idolatries, the very veils that darkened the hearts of nations. So he became a storm against grave worship, against supplicating to saints, against belief in intercessors, not because he sought controversy, but because he saw it as betrayal, a crack in the fortress of divine unity. His theological masterpiece, Al-Aqdah al-Wasitiyah, emerged from this passion, a compact, piercing statement of Sunni belief. Composed in response to a request from a judge in Wasit, it laid out the attributes of Allah as revealed, without twisting their meaning, ta'wil, nor denying them, ta'til, nor likening them to creation, tashbih. "Say what Allah says about himself," he wrote, "and stop where the prophets stopped." For this, his critics accused him of anthropomorphism. He was summoned to trial. He stood before judges, challenged by theologians, wrapped in Greek logic and speculative kalam. But Ahmad stood unmoved. He did not tremble before complexity. He cut through it. He wasn't anti-reason. He was against reason divorced from revelation. His approach was not to destroy philosophy, but to re-anchor reason in divine speech, the sword of the scholar. Yet Ibn Taymiyyah was not only a theologian, he was a political mind, fierce and unafraid. When the Mongols swept through the Muslim world, some converted, most brutal, he refused to accept their Islam as a shield from criticism. He declared that any ruler who did not judge by what Allah revealed was unjust, even if they claimed Islam. He issued fatwas of resistance, making it a duty to stand against tyranny, against foreign invasion, and against hypocrisy in power. His famous fatwa on the Mongols would later become one of the most discussed legal and political verdicts in Islamic history. His pen, dipped in ink and sharpened by suffering, called for leaders who ruled by justice, not whim, scholars who spoke truth, not praise, and people who feared Allah more than kings, controversy as inheritance. But such clarity came with a price. Ibn Taymiyyah became a lightning rod. He debated Sufis, clashed with Ash'ars, criticized kings, and rejected the blind imitation of juristic schools, even his own Hanbali tradition, if it conflicted with evidence. Many scholars admired his mind, but condemned his method. He was banned from issuing fatwas more than once. He was imprisoned for reviving debates some believed should remain buried. In Cairo, Baghdad, and Damascus, his name became legend, spoken in whispers by some, with pride by others. But even his fiercest enemies could not deny his brilliance. Ibn Taymiyyah, one of his prominent critics, once said, "Had Ibn Taymiyyah not been so consumed by debate, he would have been unparalleled." And perhaps in that tension between the scholar's pen and the sword of controversy, his true genius was born. Seeds for centuries. Though he died in the 14th century, the 18th and 19th centuries would see his name rise again. In the deserts of Arabia, a scholar named Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab would study his works and launch a movement of reform under the banner of Tawhid. In modern times, thinkers from South Asia, North Africa, and beyond would revisit his calls for revival, ijtihad, independent reasoning, and moral courage. He was cited by reformers and revolutionaries, traditionalists and modernists. Some used his works as a ladder to reformation, others as a sword for militancy, sometimes misreading him, sometimes invoking him out of context, yet his influence was undeniable. He had become a living debate, a scholar whose books refused to die.
The light behind the walls.
Damascus had fallen silent. It was not the silence of peace, but of exile, of a man whose voice had stirred the streets too deeply, too often. In the bowels of the citadel, the prison was cold, and the ink had begun to dry. They had taken his books. They had forbidden him from writing. They thought silence would extinguish him. But how do you cage a heart that walks with God? Worship in chains. Within those stone walls, Ibn Taymiyyah's body may have been confined, but his soul roamed vast gardens of worship. He prayed deep into the night. The dungeon floor became his mihrab. His voice, once thundering in lecture halls, now whispered verses of the Qur'an, sometimes in tears, sometimes in thunderous weeping. And in those nights, he found something sweeter than victory: intimacy with Allah. "What can my enemies do to me?" he once said. "My paradise is in my chest. My imprisonment is a retreat. My execution is martyrdom. My exile is a journey for Allah." These were not just words. They were the air he breathed. Each hardship was, to him, a divine invitation. Each moment of solitude was a reunion with the one he loved most. A heart molded by Qur'an. The Qur'an was not simply a text to Ibn Taymiyyah. It was his mirror, his medicine, his constant dialogue. He memorized it early, but in prison, he lived it. He would recite long passages deep into the night. Sometimes, when guards passed by, they heard his trembling voice repeating the verses of Surah Al-Fatiha again and again, as if he were carving it into his soul with each breath. "You alone we worship, and you alone we ask for help." In a letter to a student, he wrote, "There is no delight in the world like the delight of knowing Allah and worshipping Him." And in the heart of the believer, this love becomes more real than the love of wealth, status, or even life itself. His knowledge did not come merely from texts, but from absorption, reflection, and pain refined into clarity. Letters of gold. Though stripped of pen and paper, Ibn Taymiyyah's earlier letters, written during his lighter imprisonments, still read like poems of fire and light. To a distressed student, he wrote, "Be patient, for the truth has always had few allies, and know that the soul finds its wings not in ease, but in the winds of adversity." He encouraged scholars to speak truth, even if it meant exile. He urged rulers to judge justly or be judged. And he reminded the common believer that faith is not a garment worn in comfort. It is a sword carried in storms. The scholar's last breath. By 1328, the prison had taken its toll. His health had deteriorated. His beard was now white as his turban once was. But his eyes still carried the spark, the flame that no chain could crush. One early morning, after spending the night in prayer, he rested his head upon the Qur'an beside him and never rose again. The guards found him like that, at peace, a faint smile on his lips, as if he had finally been called to the majlis of the everlasting king. When word of his death spread, thousands gathered in Damascus to pray over him. Some reports say over 200,000 people walked in his funeral procession, some weeping, some silent, in awe. A death without defeat. He died in chains, but not in defeat, for he left behind not only books, but a blueprint for revival. He taught that faith was not passive, that worship was not ritual, but rebellion against injustice, idolatry, and ignorance. That the scholar must stand between the tyrant and the people, with a voice sharper than a sword. And in doing so, he became more than a scholar. He became a symbol, a thorn in the side of hypocrisy, a refuge for those searching for certainty, a fire that still burns in the halls of thought and the hearts of seekers.
Echoes in the dust of empires.
When Ibn Taymiyyah was buried, Damascus trembled, but the trembling did not end with the sound of his funeral prayers. It continued across time, in footsteps, in ink, in fire. He had planted something that would not rot with his bones, a theology of return, a politics of accountability, and a call to pure monotheism that burned through centuries like a desert wind. Awakening in the Najd, the Wahhabi revival. It was nearly 400 years later, in the 18th century, that the first major spark from Ibn Taymiyyah's legacy would flare. A scholar named Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab, born in the arid plains of Najd, found in Ibn Taymiyyah's works a voice that spoke to his own time, a time riddled with grave veneration, saint worship, and rituals, alien to the Qur'an and Sunnah. To him, Taymiyyah wasn't just a scholar of the past. He was a mujaddid, a reviver sent by Allah to awaken the sleeping ummah. The movement he led, which would later be known as Wahhabism, adopted Ibn Taymiyyah's emphasis on Tawhid al-Uluhiyyah, exclusive worship of Allah alone, opposition to innovations, bid'ah, calling rulers and scholars to account through the lens of divine law. In alliance with the House of Saud, Ibn Abd al-Wahhab's mission became both a spiritual awakening and a political force, eventually birthing a new state, the First Saudi Emirate. Though historians debate the nuances, the intellectual DNA was clear. Taymiyyah had returned, the modernists and the militants. In the 20th century, Ibn Taymiyyah's legacy fragmented like light through a prism, each beam refracted through a different lens, each one laying claim to his message. In South Asia, scholars of the Ali Hadith movement translated and taught his works as part of a revivalist campaign to return to authentic hadith and abandon blind following, taqlid. His arguments against speculative theology and imitation resonated with reformers across the region. Meanwhile, in Egypt, thinkers like Jamal al-Din al-Afghani, Muhammad Abduh, and Rashid Rida were drawn to his political courage and his call to independent reasoning, ijtihad. They saw in him a model for reconciling revelation with rational reform. Yet not all those who held his books bore his balance. Radical thinkers like Sayyid Qutb would invoke his fatwas on rulers who abandoned divine law, sometimes bending his words to justify violent rebellion in ways Taymiyyah himself might not have recognized. Extremist groups in the late 20th and early 21st centuries began quoting him selectively, extracting rulings made in specific contexts and weaponizing them for modern insurgencies. His nuanced legal reasoning was often reduced to slogans. Thus, the same scholar who wrote, "I do not declare any Muslim a disbeliever unless the proof has been established against him clearly," was now being painted as the father of takfir. The scholar who spoke of love for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, of devotion, of careful jurisprudence, was being transformed into a figure of caricature and controversy. And still, his real words remained, waiting to be studied deeply. The legacy of fearlessness. What made Ibn Taymiyyah endure? Not just his pen, not just his books, but the principle behind them, that truth must be spoken, even to kings, that the intellect must submit to revelation, not be ruled by foreign logic, that every Muslim, from scholar to shepherd, must take ownership of his faith through study, worship, and courage. His commitment to ijtihad, to returning directly to the Qur'an and Sunnah when answers were needed, became a rallying cry in every era where stagnation had set in. His dream wasn't just reform, it was revival, a purification of hearts and institutions alike. And for those who still walk his path, not blindly, but with knowledge, he remains not a figure of the past, but a teacher in the present, a flame carried forward. In today's world, riddled with confusion, sectarianism, identity crises, and colonial legacies, Ibn Taymiyyah's voice is still heard. Some quote him in mosques, others cite him in universities, some misunderstand him, others rediscover him. But no serious student of Islamic theology, law, or reform can ignore him. He was and remains a storm of clarity in a world of fog. In the final chapter, we will reflect on Ibn Taymiyyah's humanity, his paradoxes, his softness behind strength, and what it means to live like him today in a world vastly different but aching with similar questions.
The man beyond the monument.
He was called many things: Mujaddid, reviver, Sheikh al-Islam, troublemaker, savior of orthodoxy, even heretic by some. But beyond the titles, debates, and thunderous fatwas, there lived a man who hurt, a man who loved, a man who longed for Allah more than the world could contain. Behind the thunder, he was known for his boldness, his tongue sharp like a sword, his defiance before sultans, his endless pages of legal verdicts and theological refutations. To many, he seemed like iron forged into human form. But those who knew him up close saw the other side. They saw the compassion in his arguments. They saw him weep when reciting verses of mercy. They heard him pray for his enemies at night. They watched him forgive those who slandered him, including the scholars who contributed to his arrest. In one moment, he was the lion roaring for Tawhid. In the next, he was gently teaching a child the etiquette of wudu. He was not a man who wanted power. He never sought a political office, never led a rebellion, never asked for fame. He wanted the Ummah to awaken, not to follow him, but to follow the book and the Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The balance he carried in an age that was torn between extremes, Ibn Taymiyyah walked a path of paradoxical balance. He loved the Sufis for their spirituality, but opposed innovations they sometimes introduced. He respected the scholars, but called them out when they abandoned the truth for the favor of rulers. He revered the Ash'ar and Maturidi scholars for their brilliance, but insisted that creed must be built on revelation, not Greek logic. He studied philosophy not to follow it, but to defeat it with its own tools. His genius was not that he stood outside tradition, but that he stood within it and challenged it to live up to itself. He was a jurist who fasted like an ascetic, a theologian who cried like a lover, a fighter who never lifted a sword, but whose pen shook the earth. The man who could not be silenced. His death in prison was meant to be the final chapter, but it was only the prologue to his second life. His books survived through whispers, students, copies smuggled from one region to another. Some were hidden in libraries, others were memorized and retaught. He became not just a reference, but a pulse, one that still beats in every scholar who challenges blind conformity, every youth who seeks knowledge, not just to memorize, but to revive, every preacher who refuses to be bought, every believer who longs for Allah with a love that can shake the walls of oppression. What would Ibn Taymiyyah do today? He would not tweet. He would not go viral. He would not care about likes or applause. He would be in a corner of a masjid with a student, poring over a hadith. He would be writing long letters to lost souls. He would be arguing fiercely for the rights of the poor and the abused. He would still be calling to Tawhid, still challenging rulers who replaced divine law with their whims, still saying, "You were not created to follow men. You were created to follow the Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam." And he would still smile, quietly, knowing that truth walks slowly, but it never retreats. A legacy, still burning. Ibn Taymiyyah did not come to build a sect. He came to shake us awake. His mission was not just theological, it was spiritual, moral, and deeply human. He taught us that worship is not just ritual, it is resistance. That love of Allah is not just words, it is a fire that consumes everything false. That scholarship must not be buried in ivory towers, but lived, preached, and sacrificed for. In the end, Ibn Taymiyyah was a mirror. To the rulers, he reflected justice. To the scholars, he reflected responsibility. To the believers, he reflected sincerity. To the world, he reflected the weight of La ilaha illa Allah. And to you, the reader, perhaps you see in him what many saw: controversy, brilliance, bravery. But if you listen closely, beyond the books and the battles, you'll hear something else. A call, not to follow him blindly, but to rise as he rose. to seek the truth, to worship deeply, to speak courageously, to love Allah so fully that even if the world chains you, your soul walks free, and in that freedom, you become a revival of your own.
Alhamdulillah for joining us on this journey through the life of one of Islam's great scholars. We hope this story inspired your heart and deepened your connection with the rich legacy of Islamic knowledge. If you found benefit in today's episode, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Journey to Jannah, your home for Islamic biographies, wisdom, and timeless guidance. New episodes are uploaded regularly, so turn on the notification bell to never miss a moment of insight. May Allah increase us all in beneficial knowledge and guide us on the path of the righteous. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.